Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the Everyday Judaism podcast. It is so wonderful to be here today. We are learning Siman Mem Aleph, the 41st chapter in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, in the abridged code of Jewish law. We are today going to discuss Pas Uberchas Hamotzi. We're talking about breaking bread and the blessing of Hamotzi that precedes eating bread. Now, we need to talk about something before as an introduction to this chapter. We need to just clarify. What is bread? Bread is any of the 5 grains that have water added into the ingredients. Okay, so if you have wheat, barley, spelt, oats, or rye that have water included in them, specifically water, and it has a bread-like consistency, that is bread. Now, pretzels are also made from flour and water, but it's not bread. It's not the same consistency. That's called pas haba bekisnin, which is, let's call it snack. It's a snack. Rice cakes are not bread. They're a snack. Even though they're made with rice, which is not one of them anyway, but it's made with whatever, any type of food. Like, so you even there's a big discussion whether or not tortillas are flour tortillas, right, are made out of flour and water. Is that bread? It's not really bread. I would call that more a snack. It doesn't look like bread. It doesn't feel like bread. It doesn't taste like bread. So you can have things that are made of flour and water and are still not falling into the category of bread. So the blessing you would make on those things, cake, right? Cake is also flour and water, but it's still not bread. It's cake. It's a snack. So therefore, we have to distinguish between those two. We're going to have an entire chapter discussing what falls into what category. But right now, when we're talking about bread, we're talking about actual bread. You go to the store and you find kosher bread. Okay? Make sure it's kosher. We spoke about this previously, but making sure it was baked by a Jew. So we have bread. What blessing do we recite on the bread before we eat it? We recite the blessing of Hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Okay? So now this siman is going to talk all about the idea of breaking bread and the blessing that precedes it. Al lechem gomer, upon actual bread, which is how the halacha here refers to it, actual bread versus what we mentioned, pas haba bekisnin, which is also the same ingredients, but it's not actually bread. By the way, Danishes are also falling into that category of being a snack. Nobody eats a Danish as bread. A Danish is a snack. It's a treat. Okay. So alechem gomer, upon actual bread, shehu mechameshes minedagan, which is made from the 5 species of grain. Mevorchen lefanav hamotzi. One recites before eating it the blessing of hamotzi. And after you're done eating, you recite the blessing of birkat hamazon, the grace after meals. Vidin pas haba bekisnin yavor b'siman memches. And when we get to chapter 48, we're now 41, but when we get to chapter 48, we will discuss all of these that we mentioned, the pas haba bekisnin, the snack type breads. Halacha number 2, yesh li zar. It is proper to use caution, shelo lahafsik benetilas yadayim lamotzi, not to take a break or an interruption between washing our hands, which we previously mentioned. Before you eat bread, you need to wash your hands appropriately, twice on each hand. Between washing, reciting the Netilat Yadayim, and reciting the blessing on the bread, there shouldn't be any interruption. However, one is permitted to answer Amen al eze bracha shu shomeh, on any blessing that he hears, and the delay between drying one's hands and reciting the Hamotzi should be less than it takes to walk 22 amos. 22 amos is about 45 feet, so it's about 30 seconds. All right? It shouldn't take approximately, over here he says 12 seconds. From the length of an amma, this refers even to one who remains in the same place for this amount of time. So you see over here, he says 12 seconds, give or take a few. But generally speaking, that is why when we wash our hands at home, the head of the household is the last one to wash, because he's the one who's going to break the bread and have everyone in mind. He should be the last to wash, so that way there's the least amount of time. Because if he washed first and then waited for everybody to finish washing their hands, it would be way longer than that 12 to 30 seconds. So that way, to minimize the amount of time between washing hands and reciting the blessing, the head of the household should be the last one to wash. Okay, and this is a custom in many homes. Oh, mi bais lebais, or how long it would take to walk from one house to another house. Afilu hiluch me'at, even if it's only a short walk, less than 22 amos. V'chein im diber, if one spoke, ma she'eino tzarich l'suda, what is not necessary for the purpose of the meal. So you're not supposed to talk in that period of time. Mikre hefsik, that is considered an interruption. Ubediavad im hifsik leislan ba. After the fact, if one did interrupt during this time, leislan ba, we have no issue with it, and he does not need to wash again. As long as he did not engage in any activity in between, or if he did not talk extensively regarding things unrelated to the meal, then it would be considered a diversion of his attention from his hand washing, and then he would require a second washing. So let me just explain what this means. We spoke previously about washing hands before we eat. Now we're talking about, now we're getting to the meal, to the actual meal. We're actually going to recite the blessing of Hamotzi. So between washing hands and eating, we're not supposed to have any interruption that would divert our attention from the mitzvah that we're performing here. What's the mitzvah that we're performing? We're reciting a blessing on the bread. So from washing the hands till after we already took a bite into our food is one mitzvah. So now interrupting in between would be a diversion of our focus. Right? Now, if you're talking about part of the process of what you need, for example, you need your knife to cut your challah. So you're like, where's the knife? That is part of the mitzvah, so that wouldn't be considered an interruption. If you're looking for the salt that you're going to have a little bit on the table and dip the challah into, that as well is not considered an interruption. But if you start talking about sports and you start talking about the weather, that would be an interruption, because you're diverting the attention from the mitzvah that you're about to perform. So this is an important thing to recognize and to avoid when we are having our meals, to avoid getting into such a challenge. Okay, halacha number 3, botseya bapas. One should cut the bread b'makom hamuvchar shebo, by the choicest part of the challah. Now, this is different for every person. It's different for every person. Some people like the end piece of the challah. Some people like the middle piece of the challah. Everyone likes the but the person mipnei kvod habracha, because this is a show of respect for the blessing. V'hamuvchar hu hamokem hakoshes. He says the choicest part is the part that is hardest, or the most baked, the most well-baked part. Shesham ne'afa hetev, because over there it was baked most thoroughly. Kitzur now explains how to identify the part of the bread that is most well done. V'hu hamakom, what is this place? Shekeneged hamisbakeya, that is opposite the place where the surface is cracked. So in breads like if you some of the older breads, the place where it cracks is where it got cooked the best, or baked the best. It can be concluded that this is where the bread began to bake, and hence the part that is most well done expands and presses inward. Ad shemisbakea hatzad shekenegdo, until the surface of the opposite side of that area cracks from the pressure of the expanding dough. Achzakin, however, an elderly person, shekashalo lechol pas kasha, if it's difficult for them to chew on the harder piece of the bread, yivtza b'mokam harach, then he can take the softer part of the bread. Now, again, if for an individual they don't like that part of the bread, they want a different part of the bread, that's their choicest part. Umeheyos ki ein lahafsik, since one should not interrupt bishihiyus hachituch, even with an unnecessary delay caused by cutting the bread, between the blessing of the hamotzi and the eating of the bread, al kain, therefore, chotech me'at saviv hapas, ke'ein taba'as, be'inin shim yoches beprusa yala kol hakikar imo. So he says the proper thing to do is, even before you recite the blessing of hamotzi, you take a little slice of the bread. You make a little slice of the bread, but not too deep that if you were to hold one side of the bread, it would fall off. It means just a little slice. She'im lokein, choshev kiprusa. If you would cut it too deep that it would fall apart, it's considered that you cut through it, and now it's not a whole bread. Va'anan ba'inon. And for the honor of the blessing, we endeavor, whenever possible, we recite a blessing on a whole loaf of bread, not only on a half loaf of bread. Okay, now, just so that we understand and so that we put this into perspective. When one is, well, let's talk about one meal of the week, okay? One meal, Friday night, we have a meal. You're supposed to have two chalas, one representing shamor, one representing zachor, one representing the two different commandments regarding the observance of Shabbos. One is to watch and protect the Shabbos, and the other is to remember the Shabbos. So for these two mitzvahs, we have two chalas. You don't have to open both. You open one. You don't need to open both. You can, if you'd like to, if you want more challah, but you don't need to. So now, what happens is like this. That cutting of the challah, so what you do is the halacha says you take a little slice of the challah, don't cut it all the way yet, before you recite the blessing. Why? Because you want to minimize the amount of time it takes from when you recite the blessing to you actually eat it. So if you start the cutting, it will sort of take away some of the delay of time between reciting the blessing and eating the challah. Now, in some of the knives that we have today are really, really, really sharp, and it'll be more. I find, at least, I've seen that sometimes people are trying to find where they made that slice, and just like, where did I make that slice? That's taking more time. It's not worth it, right? The idea is that it shouldn't take time. So therefore, there are people who don't make that slice of the challah in advance. So after making that little slice, you want to make sure that it's still a full loaf of bread. So don't cut it that deep. You recite the blessing of Hamotzi. And after you conclude the blessing, now you separate that piece. You cut it through and through. Kedei shetichla bracha, so that the blessing is concluded on a full loaf. The blessing is concluded on a full loaf. Similarly, when cutting a loaf that is not whole, do not cut off a full piece before concluding the blessing, so that the blessing is applying on a bigger piece, the biggest piece possible. He says, when cutting the bread for Shabbos meal, he should not cut the loaf at all, even this initial cut, ad achar bracha, till after the blessing, so that the loaves be complete, because each one representing the shamor, one representing the zachor, the two different commands of observing the Shabbos, so that both loaves should be whole and complete for the entire blessing. V'gam b'chol im hu uga daka, He says during the weekday, if you're making hamotzi, if you're reciting the blessing on a small roll, he should recite the blessing before cutting the bread altogether. Because there's not a significant delay in cutting or breaking bread on such a small little roll. So these little rolls. Now, so when does this apply? This applies in general. You're having a meal during the week. You're having a meal, even one of the other meals of Shabbat, where you have a bigger loaf of bread. You can cut it. You cut a little slice to start it, recite the blessing, and then you continue cutting the challah. Okay, halach number 4. Lo yivtza prusa ktana. A person should not cut off a small piece from the loaf, mipnei shenira kitzar ayin, because it looks like you're being miserly. Velo prusa yotze kebetza, not a piece that's too large. Lefi shenira kiravtan, because you look like you're gluttonous. However, this applies only when one is eating alone. But if he says if you have many people around the table, you have to give everyone a piece of the challah that you are now breaking apart, and you have to give each one a sizable amount that is enough of a kazayis. So then you can cut it as you see fit, so that everyone gets the size that they need. Ubishabbos, when cutting bread at a Shabbos meal, afiluim ochel avadu, even if one is eating alone, mutar levtzoa, it is permitted for him to initially cut a piece, kifi mashetzarch l'chol seuda, large enough for his needs for the entire meal. This is permitted because of the honor of Shabbos. Laharo chavivas su'uda Shabbos, to show your love for this meal on Shabbos. Shechafetz lecho bo harbe, that you want to eat a lot during this meal. You love the Shabbos meal, and I want to make the meal as joyful as possible. How do you enjoy your meal? With a big piece of challah, a big piece of bread. Yesh lechol es haprusa shebatza aleha kodem sheyocha pasacher. You should take from the bread that you sliced. You should eat that bread before you eat other breads, because sometimes people have other variety of breads. Eat from that one first. And this is done to show the love for the mitzvah. Since the blessing was recited upon this piece, it is proper. A person should be careful not to give of that bread that he just recited a blessing on to your dog, to feed your animal. Give them a different piece, but not the one you just recited the blessing on, that first piece. Okay? Now, there's another halach which is important for us to know, is that we learn in our Torah, the Torah tells us to feed our animals before we feed ourselves. We take care of our animals before you take care of yourself. So this is very fundamental, and a person should ensure that the animal, if you have a dog, you have a cat, you have a hamster, whatever it is, whatever animal you choose to entertain in your home, make sure that you feed them before you sit down for your meal. That would be inappropriate and against the Torah for one to do otherwise. Make sure that you're fed and then your animal is not appropriate. Okay, so, but you shouldn't give them of your first choicest piece of challah. Give them for them to eat what they need to eat. You recite the blessing on your hamotzi. You take your food from your hamotzi and then share it with those around the table. Okay. Halacha number 5. Kodem shivarech, before reciting the blessing, yitain shtei yadav alapas. So this is an important. The details of the law are really, really, really special. Unfortunately, not everyone knows this, but all of your 10 fingers are supposed to be on the bread. When you hold it, you hold the bread with your 2 hands. All 10 fingers on the bread. Sheyesh bohen yud etzbos. For the 2 hands have 10 fingers. Keneged yud mitzvos hatluyos bepas, corresponding to the 10 mitzvahs that are involved in the production of bread. Right? Lo sacharosh bishor v'chamor. I'm going to tell you the 10 laws that apply in making bread. Okay? You should not plow with an ox and a donkey together. Kilayim, forbidden mixtures. Leket, gleaning. shikcha, forgotten produce, peya, the edge. Each one of these we can explain. Lo sachsom, you shall not muzzle an ox in its threshing. Turuma, Maser Rishon, the first tithe, the Teruma, Maser Sheni, the second tithe, and then Challah, the separation of Challah. Each one of these is a mitzvah, and putting our 10 fingers on the Challah when we recite the blessing is representing the 10 mitzvahs that we perform in the production of making bread. Lochein, therefore, yesh yud tevos bebirchas hamotzi. For this reason also, we have 10 words in the blessing of Hamotzi. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech ha'olam, Hamotzi lechem min ha'aretz. Also for that 10, to represent these 10 mitzvahs that apply with the bread. V'yud tevos hapasuk, and the 10 words of the verse, the eyes of all look to you with hope, and you give them their food in their proper time, is also 10 words in that verse. As well, Eretz Chito Seora, the land of wheat, barley, grape, fig, and pomegranate, the land of oil, olives, and date honey, is also 10 words in the Hebrew verse. V'yud tevos b'pasuk as well, v'yitin l'cholakim mitala shamayim u'shmani haaretz, where God tells Jacob, and may God give you of the dew of the heavens and of the fatness of the earth and abundant grain and wine. This is also a blessing that was given to Abraham. Okay, Hashem, and when a person recites the name of Hashem in the blessing, Yagbias Halechem, you should pick up the bread. So you say Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam Hamotzi Lechem Haaretz. Okay, Ubeshabbos Yagbias Shtein, on Shabbos you elevate both loaves together when you recite the name of Hashem. V'yivorach b'chavan, a person should have concentration when he recites V'yidaktik lahotzi heitev, to be meticulous in his pronunciation. Es hahei shel hamotzi, to say hamotzi, not to rush it. No, no need to rush. V'yitin revach ktsas, and a person should pause slightly. Bein tevas lechem letevas min, hamotzi lechem min haaretz, because lechem ends with a mem, and min begins with a mem. So you can sometimes do like a run-on, hamotzi lechem min haaretz. It's not appropriate. It should be hamotzi lechem min haaretz, and not to make it into one word. Because again, we mentioned that it's 10 words intentionally. It's specifically 10 words, and let's not make it into 9. Shelo lavlias amem, not to swallow the mem. And after reciting the blessing, you should eat immediately. Because as we mentioned previously, it's forbidden to make an interruption from the reciting of the blessing to the beginning of the eating. Even to answer amen, we don't do that between the blessing and the eating. A person should eat a kazayas below hefsek without interruption. So a person shouldn't take a bite, and while they're chewing, talking, we know the halacha says that you're not supposed to talk while you're eating anyway. First is it's not polite. It's not nice you're talking with a full mouth. Like, a person stuffing his mouth with food and talking. It's not so polite. That's number one. But number two, the halacha says it's dangerous. You're not supposed to talk while you're eating. You can choke on your food, and it's dangerous. Don't do it. Okay? So it's not only to be polite. It's not polite because it's against the halacha. That's why. Okay, and we know why it's not polite. Now the halacha continues. Okay, so that we said. Halacha number 6. Mitzvah lahavi ala shulchan melech. It is a special mitzvah to have salt on the table. Kodem sheyivtza, before breaking bread. V'yitbol prusas hamotzi b'lechem. And you should dip the piece of bread into the salt, because the table that we eat from is like the mizbeach, like the altar in the temple. Va'achil lekarbon, and the eating around the table is like the sacrifices that were offered on the altar. Shenemar al karbonecha tikrav melach, takriv melach, as it says in the verse in Leviticus, of your every offering shall you offer salt. Okay, on every offering they brought salt. Why salt? And since our table is like the altar, tov lizoris, it is proper to take care, shelo larug of kino, to not kill a lice, a louse on it. So if you have, why? Because you're going to be eating from food that's on the table, make sure the table's clean. Okay, why do we put salt? Our sages tell us why is salt so important on the offerings as well. So salt is a preservative. Our sages tell us that this represents the preserved relationship of the Jewish people with the Almighty. That's one. Number two is that our sages, the Kabbalistic sages, tell us that when we recite a blessing over the bread, the evil forces come and want to attack us and make us take away our health, and they want to damage us, they want to hurt us. But what takes away their powers? Salt. You should always have salt on your table. Always have salt on your table, on the actual table. If you have a tablecloth, on the tablecloth, it's considered the table. So salt is a very essential component of our meal. Not that you have salt in the bread. It's not enough. You should dip it into the salt. Make sure you always have salt on the table. Okay. Halacha number 7. Im mechalek prusos hamotzi lahamesubin. If a person, this is very interesting because there are so many different customs regarding this. If you have other people sitting around the table and now you're distributing the challah around the table to everyone, lo yizrakan, don't throw the pieces of challah to the people. Now there are people, there are customs that they intentionally throw the challah. He'll probably mention that. The asur lizruk hazapas, because bread is such a honored food, such a respectable food, it would be a lack of respect for you to throw it. But you shouldn't either put it directly into someone's hand. That's why you put it onto a plate and you pass the plate. You don't actually give ela yanichal lefanov, but you should place it in front of the person because it says it is proper to avoid placing the bread in his hand, since it is the custom to place the bread into the hand of a mourner. And we don't want that same symbolism of putting bread into the hand of a mourner as us. There's many, many laws that we observe because of things that are done either for dead people or for in the ritual purification of someone who is deceased. We have the Chevra Kadisha, which is the burial society. They prepare the body with dignity into shrouds, but before they do that, they wash the body, which is why, if anyone's familiar, there's an age-old custom that you don't pour a drink backwards. You don't pour a drink backwards. You only pour it forwards. Why? Because when they pour the water over the deceased, so you have one person pouring warm water to clean the body and one person cleaning. So in the inevitable, someone's going to be pouring the water backwards because you're standing on one side is the person pouring and one person is the side cleaning. So you're going to be pouring it like that. You don't want to pour your drink the way you pour water on a deceased. All right. Now there are people like, oh, you poured it backwards, throw it out. Like, no, there's no need to waste because of it. But you understand that there's a lot of superstition that's involved with it, and some of it is justified. Right? You hand bread to a mourner, you don't do the same for living. Okay. There's other laws of how we cut our nails. Right? The grooming of the nails that you do for someone who's deceased is in a specific order, so we do it differently because we don't want it to be the same as for the same care that you deal with someone who's deceased shouldn't be for the same care that we handle with those that are living. Okay, this is again we can learn. We'll talk about this in a different class. Okay, now Halacha number 8. Mitzvah. Okay. Mitzvah livtzoa al hapasa choshev yoser. It is a mitzvah to break the bread and recite the blessing upon the bread that is more significant. Therefore, if a person has a cut piece of bread and a whole roll of bread, a whole loaf of bread, and he has intention to eat from both of them during the meal. So which one does he recite the blessing on? And they're both of the same type. Who cotton yosem and achatichos, v'gam enu noki kemo achatichos, mikol mokom yivtza lasholim dehu choshev yosef. So you have a sliced bread, and then you have a whole loaf of bread. Which one do you recite the blessing on? You recite it on the whole loaf, even if the whole loaf is smaller than the actual cut piece already. But since it is more respectable that it's a full loaf, you recite the blessing on the full loaf. Okay, it's not about the size, it's about what is more honor for the blessing, for the mitzvah that we're performing here. If they're not of the same type of bread, so one is one kind of bread, one is another kind of bread, one is a French bread, and one is a sourdough bread, one is a this type of bread, whatever it may be. Now, the sliced bread that's already sliced in front of you is of higher quality to you than the one that's the loaf of bread. So now which one takes precedence? Kigon sha'ashalom mipas kisnin ve'achatichu pas chitin. If the whole bread, the whole loaf is spelt bread, and the sliced bread is wheat bread, afilu hiktana mivarach al chitin. Because one is more honorable bread, you recite the blessing on that which is more honorable. V'im hasholim hu shel seorim, and if the whole loaf is made of barley, af al pi shehu garua mechitin, even though it is inferior to chitin, mekal makom, nevertheless, kivon shegam seor niska beferish b'pasuk, since this barley grain is explicitly mentioned in the verse in the Torah talking about the 7 species with which the land of Israel is blessed, v'gamhu shlema, and it is also a whole bread. L'chein Yerushalayim yesh lachlok kavod, gam lozeh shel seorim v'sholim. So therefore, a God-fearing person should show the proper respect to the whole loaf of barley bread as well. Kitzur Shulchan, how do you do this? Meniach es hachaticha tachas hashlema ubotzeh mishtem yachad. So what do? You have the more honorable bread. You have a whole loaf of also barley bread. So what do now? You're like stuck. So what do is you hold them together, the sliced bread, the sliced under the loaf. You recite the blessing together. Don't forget when you say the name of Hashem, you lift up the bread. And then when you cut it, you cut through all of them. And now you sort of fulfilled both parts of this. Im shtem shlemos, if both breads are both whole, or both are cut sliced bread, slices of bread. Then they're both of the same kind of grain. Yivorach al hanaki yose. You recite the blessing. You recite the blessing upon the one that is of finer flour. Ve'im shteim shavas b'nikius. And if they're both fine, Yivarach al yoser gadol, on the one that is larger. So again, this is all priorities of which one takes precedence, which one is more honorable. And this, again, can change based on the individual. Because if someone likes a certain bread more, someone likes, for example, for whatever reason, someone may like spelt challah more than they like a wheat challah. So that's for them more honorable, and that would be perhaps, again, look into it. You can ask this in Ask Away number 29. We'll see. Halacha number 9. We have just 2 more halachas. Im yesh lofanat. If a person has in front of him 2 breads, pas yisrael v'pas akum, bread that was baked by a Jew, and kosher bread that was baked by an idolater, ve'eno nizar mipas akum, and this person is not necessarily cautious about the laws that we previously mentioned of bread that was made by an idolater, im shteim shleimus, if they're both whole, or shteim prusas, or they're both cut, vegam shavos bigdolos, and they're both equal in size, vehein mimin echad, and they're of the same type, yivarach hapas Yisrael, then you recite the blessing. It means everything's equal. You recite the bracha on the one that was baked by a Jew, the im zeh shel Yisrael, and if the one that was made by the Jew was made of lesser quality, less fine flour, then it's your choice. You can make the blessing whichever you choose. But if the person is cautious about bread from an idolater, but he brought it only because he had a guest who does eat such bread, then it's best for you to recite the blessing without it being present. And after you're starting the meal, or after the meal has begun already, then you can bring that bread to the table. Kol din k'dima, halacha number 10. The entire halacha, giving precedence to the more significant bread, eino elo imdato lecho betocha seuda mishten, is only when you're planning to eat from both of them during the meal. But if you're only planning to eat from one of them during the meal, then you recite the blessing on the one that you're planning to eat during the meal. And we don't care which one is more of a respectable or more significant bread. It's the one that you're going to eat is the one that you recite the blessing on. Okay, so now I just want to summarize this quickly, is that we need to understand that in Judaism, everything matters. Everything matters. I want to share with you a very interesting halacha. We know that when we recite the Kiddush Friday night, we cover the bread. Why do we cover the bread? We all know. It's something that every school child knows. They learn this in school. We cover the challah so that you don't shame the challah. You cover the challah because all meals begin with the bread, and now you're beginning the meal with wine. It shouldn't shame the challah that you're not beginning this meal with the bread. That's why you cover it. Last time I checked, my challah doesn't have feelings. Last time I checked, my challah couldn't care less. So why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? We're doing this because we're teaching ourselves to have sensitivity. If we're so sensitive for the bread not to be shamed, you can be sure that we'll be certain to not shame our fellow man. We'll be certain not to shame our spouse. We'll be certain not to shame our children. If we're careful and we're cautious not to shame the bread, it's even more so that we'll be cautious not to shame others. And it's a beautiful idea. There's a story that's told about the Chatzitzah. The Chatzitzah was once a guest in someone's home. We know the Chatzitzah traveled a lot. Why did he travel? Because he was selling his books. Many of the books that we have here in our magnificent Torch library are books that were written by the Chatzitzah. He wrote 24 books in his lifetime. Now, he wasn't a John Grisham novel writer. He was taking halacha from sources and making it practical and easy, palatable for people to understand in this generation. And his books, every single one is a masterpiece. Chafetz Chaim didn't want to waste time, and he himself would go from city to city and sell his books, not so that he would give it out. Not, by the way, very interesting. The Chafetz Chaim said that there's no copyright on his books. No copyright in his books. Anybody who wants can publish it on one condition. That you give a certain percentage, I don't know the exact number, you give a certain percentage of your printing out for free. So if you print 1,000 books, let's say it's 20%, 200 books need to be distributed for free. So that more Torah is learned in the world. The Chafetz Chaim wasn't thinking about making money. He wasn't about becoming wealthy. Just if he did, he'd be enormously wealthy. At least his grandchildren would be, because there's no house that doesn't have his books. But the Chofetz Chaim put no copyright on his books, because he felt that he was a vessel to distribute God's word to this world. And he wanted no part of earning a wealth out of it, earning a living out of it. He wanted just that more and more people should be influenced by his writings and by the word of Hashem. So the Chofetz Chaim was once a guest in someone's home. And the man, as they come home from shul, they're about to recite the Kiddush. He says to the wife, "Where is the cover for the challah? Where's the cover for the challah?" So the Chofetz Chaim asks the guy, why do we need to cover the challah? He says, "What do you mean? So that we don't embarrass the bread." He said, "But to embarrass your wife, you can." You see, the idea is we have to take these lessons to practicality. We have to take these lessons to actualize it in our day-to-day lives. That it shouldn't be just a concept. Yeah, we shouldn't shame the bread, but shaming our wife, that's okay. Shaming our children, shaming our neighbor, shaming our friend, shaming a classmate, God forbid, right? These are things that a person should be very, very careful about. The level of priority is teaching us sensitivity. And we have to institute that sensitivity into our lives in every area, not only about the bread. And you know what? Sometimes people get caught up about the law that they're like, oh, they start making a whole big ruckus about it and then calling people names. No, because you don't understand it. That's not, you're losing the point. If you start getting all caught up in the minutia and you don't see the broader picture, that the way in which we conduct should be with sensitivity in every area of life, not only with which bread do we recite the blessing on. In every area of life, you should be cautious of giving proper honor. It says that when someone who's over 70 years old walks into the room, you have to stand up, because someone who's 70 years old has wisdom. They lived a lot of life, and therefore they walk, even a non-Jew. You stand up for them. Why? Because they have wisdom. We respect wisdom. So that also includes someone who's not 70 years old who has wisdom. Someone who's a rabbi, someone who's a scholar, we give them honor. Open the door, let them walk in first. Because the Torah, these laws that we see here in chapter 41 of the abridged Code of Jewish Law are practical things for our day-to-day life, not only about breaking bread. We need to learn to apply it to other areas of life. My dear friends, let's go right into Ask Away number 29. Have a great week, everyone.